Well, it's happened. Freddy Peralta is no longer a Milwaukee Brewer. The Brewers and the New York Mets agreeing to a deal on Wednesday night to send Peralta and Tobias Myers to the Big Apple. In return, the Brewers picking up two of the Mets' top five prospects, Jet Williams and Brandon Sproat. We're going to break it all down on the Brewer Fanatic podcast. We weren't going to do an episode this week, but the timing worked out. I don't know if I would say worked out well for us because we've both been pretty busy outside of Brewers baseball. But it worked out well in the sense that Thursday is the day that we would normally record an episode, and the deal broke the night before. So we've got quite a bit to get into here. We're just going to talk strictly about the trade this week, the players that the Brewers got back, the calculus behind the move, and maybe some of the ripple effects on the 2026 team and beyond. But before we dive into that, I do need to ask Spencer how he's doing, even though I've seen him every day this week.
Yes, we have been seeing a lot of each other. Always great and pleasant, of course. No, I've been good. I mean, it's busy. It's very busy, like you said. But it's busy for the best reasons, which is baseball. So I can deal with that. Yeah, it's been a good start to our college stuff. It's been an exciting time, obviously. About as big a trade as the Brewers were ever going to make this offseason, or probably the biggest move, period, they were ever going to make this offseason, broke last night as we were about to walk into practice. So that was perfect timing.
In the middle of a game planning meeting.
Yes. Yep. Game planning and then right into practice. So yeah, if you noticed we weren't very active right after the trade broke, that's because we had something else that we were supposed to be doing. But we're here now. We're here to talk about it. And yeah, I'm excited to do it.
All right. Well, first of all, I guess we're just going to gauge initial reactions to the deal. We both know what we're going to say because we talked about it as it was going down once we had a chance last night to each other. But Spencer, I'll kind of let you be the first one to talk about the return because you're more of the prospect guru. But I think that this is a very fair return for Freddy Peralta. I think it lines up with what his value should have been on this year's trade market. I am, however, mildly surprised, not shocked, but mildly surprised that the Brewers didn't require a gross overpay to get them to pull the trigger. Because we did talk about how, given how much Freddie means to the organization, they were going to put a high price tag on him, and they did all the public posturing of saying there's a high price tag on him. But the one thing that we had talked about throughout the offseason was what exactly is it going to get them, or what exactly is it going to take to get them to go through the deal? And maybe it needs to be somebody just completely floors them with an offer. I don't think that this is a knock your socks off return, but it's a good return. And that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Yep. I'm with you. Yeah, mildly surprised is probably the best way to put it. Like, it's not some insane shock to me, but like, we talked a bunch of times that we were looking at a Corbin Burns plus type of return. And I think you're talking about two headliners that are higher up on that scale than what they got in the Burns deal. And we'll dive into all of that more as we talk about this. But like, for me, the two upper level talent prospects that you got in return are better than the two that you got in the Burns deal. You're not getting the comp pick that you got in the Burns deal. And you did have to give up Tobias Myers as part of the deal. And we'll talk about that as well, I'm sure, as we go through this. I don't think it's a huge deal. I don't think it added a ton of value to the trade, but it's part of the equation too. So in the end, I think it is something where they came out very well. Like, this is a good trade from the Brewers' perspective, but a little surprising to me that it didn't require, a lotto ticket type as that third player maybe in return, and that they actually had to add a player to the equation to be able to make it work with the Mets. But in terms of the actual return, it's two guys that we talked about on the last episode when we were asked about some of this stuff. Like, I talked about Jonah Tong, Jet Williams, and Brandon Sproat as guys that I thought would make a lot of sense as people who would combined, you probably only looking at two of them, but two of them could form a pretty good trade package that would at least get the conversation started. and probably in a pretty strong direction. And obviously, it kind of came to play out that way. We didn't talk a ton about the guys, though, during that episode. We just kind of mentioned them as good possibilities. So I guess just to bring in a little bit more on both of them, like I talked about both of them probably being a higher tier than what we saw from Ortiz and Hall in the Burns deal. And I do think that's true. Both of those guys, when the Burns deal happened, were kind of hanging on the edge of a top 100. I think each of them was on one, maybe two, but they weren't on all of them. They weren't really consensus top 100 types. These two are much closer to the consensus top 100. Jet Williams has been ranked, almost into the 30s. They've been ranked a little bit higher than we've seen from the other two, even prior to the trade to the Brewers. So this is a good return. And Jet Williams, the only thing I said about him was that he was a very Brewersy player on the last podcast because he is 5'7". He is full of energy. He's athletic. I would say the difference between Williams and a lot of these other shorter players that we've seen on the Brewers, and they obviously have no fear in adding these types of players and involving them in the roster. Jet Williams has more power than the other guys that have come through here at that size. When the Caleb Durbin trade happened last year, we talked about how he did a really good job pulling the ball in the air, but the true power numbers and the true ability to hit the ball hard really wasn't very high. He was able to maximize some of the power just from pulling the ball in the air. Jet Williams, just to give context to it, had a 103.4 90th percentile exit velocity. And I was looking through kind of the MLB 90th percentile exit velos, and that puts him in the company of like Jake Cronenworth, Gleyber Torres, Carson Kelly, guys from this last year who were like 15, 17 home run type guys. But he does pull the ball in the air a lot along the lines of Durbin as well. So he's got a little more, he's got more juice in the bat. Durbin, for example, was barely over 100 in MLB last year. Now, this might not translate perfectly to the big league level, obviously. It doesn't mean he's going to be at 103.4 in the big leagues, but trying to at least give a little context to what he was doing with some of the pop. And after he moved to AAA, it was a small sample, but he was even up to 104.4. So he showed it a little bit more in AAA. But in AAA as well, he pulled the ball in the air at a 21% clip. That was 92nd percentile in that at that level. So I think there's some actual juice here. So I think everyone kind of sees the profile, sees the size, and just assumes it's the same exact thing that the Brewers have had with a lot of these smaller guys on offense. I don't think that's the case. I think this is a guy who can be a 15-plus homer guy in the big leagues, and is an actual threat. And even just to bring in like Fangraphs grades here, their raw power grade on him was 50 current power, 55 future, and their game power was 40 present, but 55 future as well. So they think there's even possibility for above average power from a guy his size. So just wanted to clarify that right away. But he does share a lot of other similarities with those other smaller players for the Brewers. He's very fast. Fangraphs gives him a 60 in the speed department. Other publications have had him at 70. He is a well above average speed guy. And even when he got to AAA, I saw a stat today. I believe he only had 30-some opportunities to sprint, and 13 of them qualified as bolts, which are 30 feet per second or higher, which would have been, even just in that small sample, that would have put him in like the top 5 for the Brewers last year on a fast team. So he can move. I think the question is going to be, the defense, and we got some questions about that, so I won't get too deep into that. But I like Jet Williams. It's a different profile than a lot of the small guys that the Brewers currently have. And then Brandon Sproat, I honestly want to let you handle that one a little bit more, Jack, because I know this is the one you're excited about.
Yes.
But just to give like a quick little rundown on him, like it's a deep pitch mix, something the Brewers obviously have put a lot of value in for years now, but you really see it up and down their rotation over the last few years. But there's pretty high profile stuff as well. Like we've seen him hit triple digits in the minor leagues. His fastball averaged in AAA last year. It averaged 96.6 on the four seam, 95.7 on the sinker. In his short big league stint, it was basically the exact same. And that was actually with a little bit of a dip early in the season, which he kind of regained later in the season. So I'll let you get into more of like the true pitch shapes and how you expect the Brewers to use it. But this is a fun arm that I think the Brewers can do a lot of good with.
I want to go back to Williams just to talk a little more about him because, like you said, I think for me at least, I don't know about you, but there's a difference between who I think is going to end up being the real jewel of this deal and who a lot of the prospect evaluators seem to have more hype surrounding. I think Sproat's going to be the guy they actually end up getting more value out of for a couple different reasons that we'll get to in a little bit. And part of it too is I'm not quite sure what to make of Jet Williams' hit tool. You talked about all the other things that he does really well. I think you're right. There's legitimate power in there for his frame. I think you're actually probably looking at a guy who, if it clicks, probably a pretty consistent 15 to 20 homers a year in the big leagues. I think that's in there for him. So, like you said, not quite like the punch and Judies that the Brewers have throughout that batting order with all those shorter guys. But the hit tool is interesting because I looked around. Baseball America and Pipeline both had it at like 55. Eric Longenhagen at Fangraphs had it at 30 present, 40 future, which is a pretty big gap there. Like that's the difference between an above average hit tool and a not so good hit tool. So I'm curious kind of what the difference is there. Sounds like part of the concerns, at least from Longenhagen's standpoint, is he's not quite sold on that uppercut swing path. He thinks it can be exploited a little bit as he's facing higher level pitching. If you look at his contact rates throughout the minor leagues, in the lower minors, they weren't great, but they were fine. They were like perfectly average at a couple different stops. I think a little bit above average. But once he got to AAA late in 2025 and he's facing slightly higher level pitching, there was a lot of whiff in that small sample of like 30 some games. He did hit 7 home runs in that time, so you could see the power coming through. But he had, I think, a 19th percentile in zone contact rate in AAA after he got that promotion. So the reason that this kind of gives me a little bit of pause is we've seen the Brewers have a lot of success in developing kind of those high floor, not so high ceiling guys who put the ball in play a lot and they scrap. And uh, I think you could still include Terang as an example because that's how he started out before he's now gone to the next step of reintroducing the raw power and learning how to utilize that in the big leagues against big league pitching. But Durbin and Friedlich are good examples of, okay, these guys are not going to crush the ball. They put it in play a lot. And when it works, you're talking about average hitters, maybe a little bit above average when they're getting the right batted ball luck, but not a very high ceiling. They're just not going to get a whole lot better than that. This is a little bit different. When they have a guy who does not have a great hit tool, they have not had basically any success with guys who have even mediocre hit tools within the last 10, 15 years here. So I'm very curious to see if they're able to finish that development because it seems like to me between the two, he's still the one who's got a little bit of development left and maybe not quite big league ready right out of the gates here. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the show as we start to talk about how this impacts the way the roster might look. But I'm curious to see if they're able to refine that hit tool to a point where it is a little more clearly playable in the big leagues and it allows him to take advantage of his other skill sets. But at the same time, I think that they have so many of those bat to ball guys that these are the kinds of prospects they need to start going for. They need to start, number one, just taking chances on these guys and figuring out how to develop them because we spend all our time talking about how this lineup is very good at getting on base. It's very fast, take extra bases, do all these little things, but they need more power. And I do like bringing in Jet Williams as one of the main pieces in this deal because he has a little more power potential than some of these other guys. I'm just not sold yet on the Brewers' ability to bring it out consistently enough or to just get that hit tool up to a point where it's consistent enough. But again, it's interesting because it really seems to just depend on which scout you're asking, whether he has a perfectly fine, solid hit tool. Like there are some scouting reports that paint him as more of that Pat Murphy type bat to ball scrappy guy. And then there's some scouting reports that say actually he's got good pop for his size. And then some of the other tools are a little more suspect in the box. So there seems to be a wide range of opinions on him. And actually, this would be not a bad time to bring in one of the questions we got on Jet Williams. The Ginger asks, it seems like he has a wide prospect ranking, anywhere from top 30 in baseball to around top 80 in baseball in major prospect evaluations. So anywhere within the top 30 to being in the low 80s, depends on which ranking you're looking at. And he asked, where do you see him? Assuming a lot of the question marks is how good his defense is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have like a personal ranking within the top 100, so it's kind of hard for me to be too precise, but just based off of what I know of him and general prospects around the league, I think in that like 60 to 70 range is probably in the right range for me. Um, I don't know that there's enough there for me to feel comfortable saying like he's a top 30 guy in baseball. You could argue probably on the edge of like the top 50. I think there's a lot of good stuff here, but like we just talked about, like there are also some legitimate questions at the plate. And that's not including the defense, which is what you're talking about. So he played he played exclusively up the middle last year. It was shortstop, second base, and center field. He's obviously a very, very good athlete, but he grades out as, mostly fine at all of the positions. Shortstop is the place where he played more early in his career. It's what he was drafted as. It's what they wanted him to be originally. But as the Mets were bringing him up, they all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but they realized they had Francisco Lindor locked in for quite a long time. So part of the appeal with moving Jet Williams around was just to give him more opportunities to eventually make their roster, whether that was as a center fielder, whether that was somebody who's comfortable playing second base. My view of his defense, and I haven't had time to watch a ton of it or look into it much other than the scouting reports, but my view of his defense at shortstop is that if I were guessing and comparing it to the current big league roster and the infield options, and kind of assuming Terang probably still isn't somebody they want to put over there too often, I would say I would guess he would be better than Andrew Monasterio at shortstop. So like if these guys are all on the roster, I could see Jet Williams being the guy who they pinch hit for Joey Ortiz. Williams is the one who goes to shortstop. I guess that's maybe how I'd view the glove. It's not going to be at a Joey Ortiz level or even all that close, honestly. I think at second, it would probably grade out better, but that one's a position that's obviously pretty held down by a certain individual like Bryce Terang, who's really not going anywhere and will be there for at least a few more years. I personally think the outfield is probably where we're going to end up seeing Jet Williams more often in the Brewers system. I don't know if that means still center field as much. Maybe they'll play him in some corner spots. Maybe it is left field and they want Cherry on center, however they want to make it work. But I'm guessing that would end up being his best defensive spot once he gets more reps there. Just given his athleticism, given his speed, if he's given the time to work out there more consistently, I think that's where you'll see him grade out the best. But he will grade out fine defensively at all the spots. It's more a matter of where you're going to get the best value defensively, and I think that probably ends up in the outfield.
So I think one of the things to talk about here is what this means for the actual infield mix, especially if, like you talked about, Williams probably profiles best as a center fielder moving forward or an outfielder at the very least. Because I think a lot of people saw this right away and they saw shortstop and they thought, oh, maybe this is the Joey Ortiz replacement. Somebody else can play shortstop, anyone but Joey Ortiz, because this fan base does not like Joey Ortiz. But I don't think that's going to be the case. And we got a lot of questions about the shortstop position and what does this mean for Ortiz? What does it mean for Cooper Pratt, who is set to be waiting in the wings in Nashville? Without going into any of these specific questions, just to address the point more generally, like you said, Spencer, I don't think that he's one of their better defensive shortstops, so he's probably not going to be ending up getting a lot of time there. I think between the stuff that we talked about with the hit tool, that's probably something where he would benefit from starting the year in Nashville to just kind of keep working on things. And then once he does get here, if Joey Ortiz is doing even decently at shortstop, I don't think the Brewers are going to be pressing for a change. But if Ortiz is a better defender at short, Cooper Pratt's a better defender at short, I don't think Jet Williams is going to be challenging either of those guys on the depth chart. I think it's a lot more likely that he'll start the year in Nashville, probably bounce around a little bit in Nashville. That is one of the questions we got from HC Purdy, who said, he's thinking Pratt's getting most of the shortstop work in Nashville. So where do you think they play Williams in terms of position? I would imagine he's probably going to bounce around a lot, and they're going to give him reps at all kinds of different spots. And that's probably the role that he would fill for them if he does reach the big leagues at some point in 2026. I don't think that this is a shortstop replacement. I think a lot of people want a shortstop replacement, but I'm going to caution people that you probably should not be expecting that. Now, maybe things change if Jet Williams has just an amazing spring training and he looks really good at shortstop, but we know how much the Brewers like Joey Ortiz. We know that they're pretty deep at the shortstop position organizationally. Two of their better prospects are both good defensive shortstops. I think it's a lot more likely that between all those things and the fact that Williams probably profiles better at a different position, I would not expect to see him getting regular playing time there at any point, really.
Yeah, I would be surprised. I think, an injury to Ortiz maybe would be able to cause it if Williams is ready and they feel good enough with him playing there regularly. But it would be a pretty big surprise to me if he were to overtake Ortiz as the starting shortstop at really any point this season. Neither of us were super high on Caleb Durbin's ability to play third base last year. And he pretty quickly, after an adjustment period for sure, spring training, it wasn't very good. It was a little bit of a slow start in AAA, got better pretty quickly once he got in the big leagues. And by the end of the season, he was grading out very well defensively. Maybe the Brewers can work some of that magic with Williams. Maybe he really looks the part after a month in Nashville, and then it becomes a possibility. But that feels less likely to me than what you just said. And that's him when he makes his debut, at least. It might be a semi-regular playing time or even a little more, but I don't think it'll be at shortstop regularly. It could be some shortstop. It could be some second. And then my guess would still be most of it would be in the outfield. But I think that's probably the role you're looking at, especially early in his career. He might end up settling into more of an everyday role, but it also might end up settling into an everyday role where he is kind of the Ben Zobrist type thing, where he's just playing a different position regularly to help get guys off their feet. The versatility is something the Brewers always will value, but I just lean towards it ending up in the outfield. I think that's what we're probably looking at. And like I said, I won't rule it out. I won't say it's absolutely not happening, but I would put the odds as pretty low.
On a similar note, Ed on Twitter asked which middle infield prospects are most likely to become trade candidates because of redundancy. Again, I would say I don't know that this actually changes the calculus a whole lot for their infield system. I don't think he's really going to be displacing anyone. And the other part of this, too, is I don't really think there's a log jam yet, especially if Williams is a multi-positional guy. You have Made's playing short in Double-A. Pratt's playing short in Nashville. Williams is moving around either in Nashville or in the big leagues. I just don't think they're going to be feeling any kind of crunch where there's a guy that they need to designate as a trade candidate who they're more willing to offload than maybe some other guys. If the right deal comes up, obviously anyone's available and there is such a thing as using your depth. But I think people are kind of overestimating what this means as far as any potential changes in the Brewers infield. Like you said, I think it's more likely that if he does settle in anywhere, it's in center. I actually think that's probably where he's got a clearer path to playing time anyway, because There is a little more upside in that bat, I think, than Blake Perkins probably, if you're just kind of forecasting ahead. But that's pretty much the whole spiel on Jet Williams. We're going to move on now to, like I said, the guy who I think is probably my favorite get in this deal. And maybe I'm just saying that as a pitching guy, but I also just think that this is the kind of player that the Brewers are more likely to maximize than a player like Williams. And that's Brandon Sproat. Bucky Brewpack on Twitter asked for predictions as to who will be the most impactful player year 1 and year 5. Year 1, I think it's Brandon Sproat. Absolutely no question. Because we talked about, maybe a couple things that Williams probably could afford to work on a little bit more seasoning in Nashville. Sproat's ready to go. We'll talk about it. We got some questions on the rotation. He should probably get the rotation spot left vacant by Freddy now that he's in New York. This is a guy who I like a lot because, like you said, he's got a lot of very distinct pitch shapes. I'm going to go over the arsenal really quick. I should have pulled the graphic to pull up on the screen for those on video. But last year in the big leagues, he threw 6 pitches, all of them pretty distinct shapes. The only thing that I would probably count on the Brewers doing for sure is I don't think they're going to let him throw changeups anymore, because anytime the Brewers have a guy who throws a sinker and a changeup that is even somewhat similar movement-wise to the sinker, they just generally don't have that guy throw his changeup. And Sproat kind of falls into that category. So his sinker in the big leagues last year in 4 starts averaged almost 96 miles an hour. The changeup averaged 90. If you look at the shape, sinker was 7 inches of vert, 17 inches of arm side. Changeup was 4 inches of vert, 16 inches of arm side. So very, very close there, which again, a lot of times that can be the case for some sinker ballers. But movement and velo are both close enough that I would guess they're probably just going to scrap that in game action and maybe work behind the scenes on a different changeup, something that's a little bit different. Because they do work with guys on that. They never get to a point where they want to use them in games. But what I'm really enamored by here are the breaking balls. He's got 3 of them. They all grade out very well according to stuff models. Actually, I was looking at this when I was writing an analysis of the trade last night. Out of starters who pitched at least 20 innings in September, he was near the top in stuff plus. I think he had a 112 stuff plus in the 4 starts that he made down the stretch for the Mets in September. So I know a lot of people are kind of looking at the results in that small sample. The results in AAA were not great either. But again, Spencer, you talked about how the stuff ticked up as the year went along. Some of his peripheral numbers were quite a bit better. I believe his deserved run average was quite a bit better than average at both levels last year. But most importantly, teams are making these decisions based on projectability. So they're looking at how good the stuff is. And this is a guy who throws 3 good breaking balls. The sinker grades out as above average. The 4-seamer is not a great pitch on its own. It doesn't really get a ton of carry relative to his arm slot, but I think it's a pitch that, when used the right way, you can get a little bit of whiff at the top there. And I would guess that's probably what the Brewers are going to do. Last year was the first year of Sproat's career in which he really started to lean more into the sinker as the year went along, instead of trying to get by on the velocity on the 4-seamer. But just kind of looking at the arsenal here, we actually did get one question via email about what the Brewers might be looking to do here. Andrew asked us, it looks like Sproat throws a sweeper and a hard slider. Do you anticipate Chris Hook and company changing the slider into a cutter to have the 3 different fastballs? So I do think they're probably going to do something with that shorter slider. I think that it's already kind of close to cutter territory, not quite. But we talked about like the fastball velo, almost 96 with the sinker. It's almost 90 with that short little slider, or at least it was in the big league. So I think he's already pretty close to being in that range. And the nice thing about a guy like this is he's kind of that lower 3/4 slot where he's got a little bit of a supination bias. That's mostly a gold mine for pitch development. And you can already see it in the fact that he throws so many distinct pitches. Not everybody has the ability to create that many shapes. So when you have a guy like this who has the ability to do that stuff, I think it just gives you more to work with. There's a lot of stuff that you can tweak and kind of mold to your liking to get the shapes where you want them. But overall, I do think they're going to go with the 3 fastball approach. Since it's the Brewers, I would imagine it's going to be a lot of sinkers to righties, probably mostly sinker sweeper. And then against the lefties, you'll probably see the curveball a little more, buzz some high fastballs. If they do turn that slider into a cutter, I wouldn't be shocked if it's more cutter to lefties as well. But this is a nice arsenal here. Like I said, I think they'll probably slash the changeup or at least reduce it, but he's got weapons that he can use to hitters from both sides. It's a very well-rounded arsenal. Like I said, the stuff grades are good. He's got kind of a whippy delivery. I'm kind of curious to see what Hook does with that because they're very big on trying to get guys on time, and a lot of the adjustments that they make are all geared toward getting a guy on time. They like to bring in a lot of guys who just things aren't quite synced up great with their mechanics, so they might change Nick Mears, for example. They changed like where he was with his hands. Sometimes they'll change arm action a little bit. Like there are different things that you can do there. But I like this profile a lot. I think you can project it out pretty well. We did get some questions about kind of what the ceiling looks like for some of these guys, for Williams and for Sproat. I would not say Sproat's like top of the rotation kind of arm, but I do think that there is a very solid, probably number 3 starter in there, a guy who can give you consistent innings out of the rotation. I think he's, like I said, he's got the stuff to pitch length, deeper outings. It's never going to be the most exciting, but everything grades out well. He's got a lot of weapons, and I think the Brewers are going to have a very clear idea of how they want to use that because there is a lot to work with here.
Yeah, I would agree, especially on the ceiling there. I think if everything kind of clicks with what they want to work on, and part of it's going to be some of the command stuff. Now, he didn't have big walk issues, but the location of his pitches within the zone are something that definitely need to improve. If the Brewers can help with some of that, and some of that might be related to some of the timing that he could be having some issues with at times, I think there's as much upside as a solid 2. I mean, the stuff, the velo's there. He's got a deep mix. It's somebody who can kind of, like you said, you can get through a game with in a bunch of different ways when you have this type of repertoire. Like you might not have the slider that day, but the other breaking ball's working. Like you said, probably not a ton of changeup usage anyway, but maybe they work on that, and you do see the changeup more often in certain games, like we saw from Freddy Peralta more this year, where the changeup came a long ways over the course of his career, and all of a sudden it's a more important pitch for him. I think the 4-seam shape is something that you talked a lot about, how, they up the sinker usage, and I think that's going to absolutely continue with the Brewers. The 4-seam, if the velo is up as high as it can be, where it can get up into those upper 90s, touching 100, and he's not showing it a ton, I think it can be a really nice put-away pitch for him at times to go up at the top or above. The shape of it on its own is not very good, but the velo can make up for some of that. And if you have that wide of, or that deep of a pitch mix, it helps keep the batters from being able to time up upper 90s, even if it's not the greatest shape. So I think there's a lot of stuff to work with here. And like you said, it's the profile the Brewers do well with. It's a profile that the Brewers are very comfortable with. And by all accounts, even going back to his college days, Sproat has been very adjustable with how he does things, with how he's willing to work on certain things and change what he's doing, even this past season, going to a heavier sinker mix than the 4-seam. So it just feels like a really good combination between what the Brewers do, what Sproat does, how they both kind of approach the game and approach development from the pitching side of things. It feels like a really good mix. So yeah, I feel really good about this. I think this is somebody who, you mentioned he should get that rotation spot. I do agree. I think this is someone who should have a very, very good shot at a rotation spot. And maybe they don't like what they see in spring and they want to see a few starts in AAA or something just to hammer out some, if they're making changes, some of those things take a little bit longer to take and to get comfortable with. And he's obviously optionable. So they could option him early and then see him shortly after that, just because they wanted to work on some things in the minor leagues without any pressure on him. But assuming everything's going well, yeah, he should be in the rotation. He has the upside of probably everyone other than Miz and Woody at the top of the rotation in this season, even to be like that third starter if things do click. And if not, I think he'll settle in pretty well to that back of the rotation spot, even in his first full season in the big leagues.
So just kind of, I guess the last thing to talk about here is we did talk about how Jet Williams is probably not changing the infield picture a whole lot, but you're down Freddy Peralta. That does change the rotation picture because he's a guy who is consistently giving you about 32 starts a year for the last 3 seasons. The Brewers are going to have to fill a lot of innings now, and I think that's where, if there is a potential impact of losing Freddy Peralta, it's the durability. For all the things that we talked about when he was here, about how it wasn't always crazy consistent, how there were still some things that he just never could quite clean up that kind of kept him at the doorstep of being an ace, but never quite crossing over into that step. Filling innings is going to be tough, though, or I shouldn't say tough, but the main objective, because that's where Freddy Peralta really gave you the most value. The Brewers do have a lot of depth though in that rotation. We did get questions on who's the guy who is impacted the most by Freddy Peralta's departure. AK Brew Fan asked, which rotation hopeful does the newly open spot favor the most? Brian on Twitter talking about the rotation mix. He said Woodruff, Mizorowski, Quinn Priester have rotation spots locked in. Who gets the last 2 out of spring training? Does your answer change for 2027? And he also had some notes about Aaron Ashby and DL Hall. We'll get to that in a little bit. But I think for now, like we said, I think Sproat needs to be the guy who is the favorite for that spot. Just kind of going down the list, you've got Logan Henderson is in the mix. Robert Gasser is going to be in the mix. Coleman Crow probably a little bit later in the year. But out of those guys, and I know there's probably going to be a lot of people who want Logan Henderson to get the spot because he showed so well in the 5 big league starts that he made over the summer last year. But Brandon Sproat profiles as a better starting pitcher than Logan Henderson. He's got the deep arsenal. Henderson is working on a breaking ball that is a little bit more consistent. But until he does that, we know he's a big pronation guy. Guys like that usually struggle to get to a true consistent breaking ball shape. So there's still that relief risk there with him, and I think there'd be some benefit to him spending a little more time in Nashville, continuing to work on that, depending on how everything looks. Coleman Crow has good stuff, has not pitched in Nashville a lot because of injuries. Robert Gasser, next year or this year will be his first full healthy season. I think that he's probably got a good enough head on his shoulders and he's mature enough as a pitcher that you could plug him into the big league rotation right now and he could hold his own. But there's always some benefit to just giving him a little more time. I think out of all the guys they have, and it is a very deep mix, I don't know if this really, in my mind, changes anything for some of those guys who are on the doorstep. Obviously, I'm sure it's going to be a pretty open competition, but just looking at the way that this all factors in, I think you're probably looking at Chad Patrick and Brandon Sprout rounding out that rotation at the end of spring training, assuming everybody's healthy. Injuries can always complicate the entire thing, but I think those are probably the 2 guys that I would count on in that 4 and 5 spot. It'll change throughout the year because you need guys to fill innings over 162. Every single name that we talk about, they are going to make starts this year if they're healthy. But if there are no major injuries in Maryvale, I would expect you're going to be coming out of there with Patrick and Sproat rounding it out.
I think that makes the most sense to me too. And yeah, I think Henderson's probably the one people are going to, like you said, kind of have the most pause with. And you've seen some really good results in a small sample at the big league level. And I think he's going to be a good big league pitcher in the long term still. But it's still at this point more or less a 2-pitch mix. And it's hard to make that work. And you saw a team once and they're 2 really good pitches. Like the 2 pitches he throws consistently are very good pitches. So the first time a team sees you, it could absolutely work really well against them. The word starts to get out on a guy, teams start to see him a second time. Even as he got deeper into starts, you could kind of see guys who were just laying off the changeup and saying, I'm not swinging at the changeup and I'm just going to go after the fastball if it's in the zone. The Cleveland start sticks out to me, where he did actually start using the slider, cutter, or whatever he was throwing more that day, a little bit more consistently. And it showed that he could at least find a way to make it work. But Sproat's got 5 or 6 pitches that he'll be able to use in big league games from the start. I just think that gives him a pretty big leg up on Henderson going into it. And the other part of it being later in the year, as things happen, Henderson could very easily move into a bullpen role with that 2-pitch mix. I think the same can be said of Chad Patrick. If things change throughout the course of a year, we already know he can move to the pen and do very well there. So if other players are stepping up and gets later in the season where you're not as worried about getting through the season and getting innings and more about just winning games and doing some of that stuff, like maybe you see him in the pen and a gasser who's giving you a solid 5 to 6 innings instead of worrying about, Patrick maybe giving you a few more innings, but maybe not quite at the same level. And then the bullpen addition of him would be a really nice addition to the pen. So there's ways they can make this work beyond even just having to worry about injuries, but injuries are going to play a very big role. All of these guys are going to be seen in the big leagues more than these guys are going to be seen making starts in the big leagues for the Brewers this year. I still think there's probably going to be some sort of depth signing, whether it's, a minor league deal, a split deal, something like that, where they add another starter to the mix, or at least starter candidate. And they also have other players who are on the edge of AA and AAA who are potential future big league arms that have the type of stuff that could maybe force their way into needing innings at the big league level at some point next year. So there's a lot of depth. It's why they felt comfortable including Tobias Myers in the deal. They already have a lot of depth, and they'll probably continue to add to it, and they're all going to get innings. It's just a matter of who comes out of the gates in the rotation, and for all the reasons we just laid out, I think Sproat and Patrick do make the most sense.
To finish Brian's question, he also asked about Aaron Ashby and DL Hall. We're going to see those guys in multi-inning relief roles since it's likely that the young staff doesn't work deep into games. I would guess that I'm going to say that's the best spot for him. I do think they're going to give Ashby a pretty legitimate look as a starting pitcher. I think there's no harm in stretching all of these guys out at the start of the year, which is probably what they're going to do, and then he can very easily slide them into that multi-inning relief role. But I do think out of all of these guys who they have in that stretched out mix, I think it's a lot easier to just slide those guys in there because they've done it before. That allows you to keep some of the younger starters in Nashville stretched out if you ever need them to fill in at any point throughout the year. It does seem like the cleanest way for this all to work for me is, like we talked about, round out the rotation the way you said. Then you've got some of these guys who are going to pitch big league innings and make big league starts, but they could also benefit from a little more time in AAA. And then you have Ashby and Hall in the pen, and they can kind of give you a little bit of length down there. The other part of this, too, is DL Hall, like we've talked about, doesn't need to open the year on the roster. I believe he does still have an option year left. So that's another thing to think about as well. I wouldn't necessarily guarantee that Hall is on the roster. If his stuff looks really good in spring training, I think you do have to give him a spot. But, when you talk about like lefties, do you want that many lefties in the bullpen? The way the roster math is going to work with some guys, you still have Rob Zastrzny on the roster who is out of options. There's going to be some stuff going on there, some stuff to watch. But to me, the hierarchy of what roles guys could fill, it's not set in stone, but I feel like it's decently clear. I think who's capable of what right now. Now it's a matter of you get to spring training, you're going to see if anything changes or if anybody gets hurt. I think those are going to be the big two things to watch.
Yeah. DL Hall of the 99 mile per hour fastball in the offseason bullpen this offseason. So
I don't know. Are you putting stock into that? I don't know if I'm really putting any stock into a 99 mile an hour fastball in the bullpen. I'm sure he has thrown 99 mile an hour fastballs.
I was going to say
times throughout the last 3 years.
Right. I believe that it happened, but no, I'm not putting much into it. If there is a velo jump in there and he's now got this wider repertoire with the numerous fastballs, like that would be a very big deal for him. But I have to see that before I'm going to believe it. I'm not going to take anything out of this random one-off bullpen that he had in the middle of winter. But it would go a long way if there is a velo jump there for him. So I'm hoping it happens, but I'm not going to rely on it for sure. Otherwise, yeah, I'm with you completely. This is, I think, the best spot for both of them. They are going to give, assuming they're healthy, I think both of them the opportunity to stretch out as starters, and then both are comfortable and have already shown that they can do it, just moving back into a pen role where they kind of ease back into the 2-inning, maybe 3-inning, and then later in the season, Aaron Ashby might become more of a 1-inning guy again, where he's more high leverage because his stuff really can play. But throughout the course of a season, I think the best way to use both of those guys is to get 2 or 3 out of them a couple times a week and go forward that way. So it makes a lot of sense for them to stay out there. But you did point out, like we've talked about, there are going to be a lot of lefty options. I think we both kind of agreed most of them aren't super platoon dependent, so they'll probably be fine if that's the case. But it could be part of the equation. And yeah, there's an option left for DL Hall. It was something I was worried they were going to burn needlessly a couple years ago. And now it seems like it actually could be helpful to have it. So I'm glad that that didn't end up happening. Because I think there's value in potentially being able to send him down just for all the reasons we just talked about.
We should probably talk about Tobias Myers, who was the other piece that Milwaukee sent to the Mets in this deal. I saw mixed reactions to that on the internet. Some people who could not care less that Tobias Myers was thrown in the deal. Some people who were wondering why Tobias Myers was thrown in the deal. The fact of the matter is he just wasn't going to have a clear path to a lot of innings in Milwaukee. His career has almost certainly peaked after that rookie season. I mean, you can go back to what we were saying even after that rookie season about how he was a pretty prime regression candidate because a lot of the peripherals didn't really support the shiny low 3s ERA. The peripherals look like a capable big leaguer, a guy who can fill some innings in a swingman role, but not anybody who, you really put a star next to his name. He was fine out of the bullpen last year when they used him in that role in the second half. The strikeouts are not there. The whiffs were there, though, and he got a lot of the whiffs on the splitter. That's going to be the thing to watch for me for him in New York, because I do think that is a legitimately good pitch. So I would not be shocked if he has a little bit of a resurgence due to having that split changeup in his repertoire now. The issue, though, is I'm still not quite sure how he's going to fit that in with the rest of his mix as a starting pitcher, because when he really switched to mostly fastball splitter, the fastball actually got hit more after that point because he wasn't really protecting it with the other pitches in his arsenal. But it's just harder to sequence like a cutter or a slider off of a splitter. Like fastball splitter, that kind of needs to be your tunnel if you're going to be a big splitter guy. But like I said, I think then it just got easier. Like opponents could not hit the splitter, but I think it got a lot easier for them to just sell it for the fastball and do something with that. So he's in a weird spot. He's already peaked in his career, I think. There's probably still some more productive innings in there where he just gives you some regular season value. If he has league average results and he can throw 100 innings for you in a season or 80 innings, depending on what the role is. But it was very clear that he had fallen pretty far down the depth chart. There were valid reasons why the Brewers did not put him on their NLDS roster. And the final note, don't use ERA in the year of our Lord 2026. I can guarantee you teams are not deciding who is pitching when and who will be the better pitcher moving forward based on ERA. And that is a big part of the equation with Tobias Myers, who I think is probably going to be better off in New York than he would have been had he stayed in Milwaukee. So to me, this doesn't really change anything for the Brewers. If he was a piece that you needed to put in there to get it done, by all means, absolutely. He's just not going to be super impactful given the depth that the Brewers have and the kind of arms that they have ahead of them on the depth chart.
Right. I think an easy way to think about it too is if the Brewers were to try and trade Tobias Myers by himself, you're probably getting some sort of lottery ticket. You're getting somebody who's, there's something interesting, but there's not a ton there in return. So if that's the type of guy it takes to include him in a deal to get the deal done that you really want to get done, you do that. You do it every time. And like you said, I think this will be a better place for him. So even if there are some better results or we see some improvement in some of the things, like one, the Mets have been pretty good with these north-south type arms who work a little bit more like Tobias does. That's not necessarily been the Brewers' MO. Like Trevor McGill's very good at it, but that's a one-inning closer. A lot of these guys work more side to side. We talk about the X's and crossing the cutters and the two seams and doing all of that stuff. And we saw Tobias can do a little of that, but like you talked about, the splitter became a really good pitch for him. And it's hard to do that, to throw that pitch when you're trying to do the other things and doing the cutter stuff and working off of the edges with that type of pitch. So like just combining the whole repertoire together is going to be a difficult thing to make happen. But the Mets are a little better at that, I would say, in general. So maybe they'll do a little bit better with it with him. It's unfortunate. Like I understand why fans. You saw what happened. He had a very, very good rookie season, results wise, especially. It is funny, and we talked about it at the time. But Jack, you were obviously like the highest guy on him coming into his rookie season, and by the end of it, we're probably one of the lower people on him, despite having a really, really good season on the whole in terms of results. And I think that's pretty much how it played out the next season. Like we were talking about it last night a little bit. We both saw a guy who would get 19, 20 inches of carry on his fastball at times. And without realizing necessarily the arm angle and how much that was playing into it, it was like, oh, that's a really interesting pitch. That's part of the reason you were super interested in him going into his rookie year. But as we saw it in the big leagues, it's really not an outlier pitch at all. It's mostly in line with what you'd expect from
And
the high
mostly
spot.
there's just no deception on it. Like it does not
Right.
fool hitters at all.
Right. So the pitch that we both kind of thought at first was going to be the pitch that made him an interesting big leaguer ended up being one of his worst pitches. And it just didn't work out completely, I think, the way we thought it could eventually, but it never came together totally, and that's fine. It might come together a little bit better with the Mets, but I don't really anticipate him doing too much more. I agree with you that I think we saw his peak, and it was a fun season for a guy who at that time was like fighting to even get a job to stay in pro ball a year prior to that. So like it's a cool story. I'm really happy for him that it worked out, and I'll be rooting for Tobias Myers. He seems like a great guy, but it's kind of just a meh that he was included in the deal for me. Like it just doesn't move me in either direction. It was, if that's what it took to get the deal done, I do it every time.
Just to kind of wrap up here, tie everything together on the Freddy Peralta trade. I'll give the quick speech again of why the Brewers do this. The Brewers' whole MO is they want to acquire guys before they establish themselves in the big leagues. Enjoy those players' best seasons from age 23 to 30, roughly, on bargain salaries, thanks to rookie contracts and arbitration and all that stuff. And then by the time these guys are ready to hit free agency, number one, they know that these guys have probably already had their best seasons. They're going to want to get paid market value for the production that they have had. And the Brewers don't feel that that's the best use of their resources, so they're going to trade them away usually and get younger players to start the process over. This is a big reason why the Brewers are winning roughly 90 games almost every single year. You know, you can have conversations about should they at some point make a bigger splash to try to push things over the top. We're not going to have that conversation right now, but this is the way they operate. It's been very successful. And the key to this is finding the right balance, too, of knowing when to trade whom. And I think the one time that they really didn't do a great job, certainly on the clubhouse side, was the Josh Hader deal that had some pretty bad ripple effects. They haven't traded anyone in season since that happened. And between deciding to move Corbin Burns and Devin Williams, keeping Willie Adames, I think they made the right call on those three guys, and they struck the balance very well. So, Spencer, I'm curious, how do you think they did on the Freddie situation? Because we had talked about how we thought he might be closer to that Willie Adames territory. And I think that was reflected a little bit in what they got back for him. They got a better return than what they got for Burns, not in volume, but in the quality of the prospects.
Mm-hmm.
But like we said, it wasn't an offer that just completely knocked you over, but they still felt it was good enough and that they had to do it. And Freddie's been a big clubhouse presence. You do have Brandon Woodruff back as a veteran starter. He, as Matt Arnold eventually revealed, actually did play a role in this. They felt more comfortable moving Freddy Peralta, which we had talked about before too, saying that it may not have a huge impact, but if you're kind of right on the borderline of like, do we take this or not? Maybe having Woodruff back kind of pushes you over the line, and maybe that's what happened here. But the question is, to wrap it up, how well do you think they struck the balance here of thinking of now and thinking of the future and the clubhouse implications and all the stuff that goes into decisions like these?
Yeah, I think from a clubhouse perspective, if you're going to trade people, and they learned this in the Hader situation, it should be the off season. It's not something where you've been around, the whole team's been around each other for 4 months, and now you're just pulling them out of it, and you have to continue the season the next day or the same day that the trade happens. You have time now to kind of let this settle in, let some of the players who are friends and very close with Freddie, and obviously Freddie is known for a lot of good things on the field, but I think maybe more than anything is known for just the presence and the like ever present smile on his face when he's around the field in the stadium. And I do think that's something that, they'll probably miss a little bit. I think that's kind of similar to what we talked about with Adamas. And we talked about how he had really grown into a leader this year. And those are things that the Brewers will miss. And it's a difference between some of the others that they had traded. And it's the reason they held on to Adamas. But I think while this could have some implications in the clubhouse, I don't really expect it to. Another thing we've talked about a lot, that's Pat Murphy's strongest suit as a manager, is his ability to make sure that the clubhouse and everybody are kind of on the same page, pulling in the right directions. You have other leaders in the clubhouse. You have Christian Yelich. Like you talked about, Matt Arnold mentioned having Brandon Woodruff around helped them feel more comfortable with this decision. And it'll be a difference. Like, this is a guy who brought a ton of energy and brought a ton of all that stuff to the field, but I don't think it's anything that's going to really hamper the team in terms of performance stuff, or non-performance stuff. I mean, like, it's going to be some on the field innings that the Brewers have to replace, and some perform. He was obviously an all-star and he overperformed compared to like his peripherals pretty well last year, but even the peripherals were in a really good spot. Like, he was a good pitcher last year, just maybe not as good as the end results were showing. So it's a guy you have to replace. In terms of the balance, I think they did a really good job. I think this is a good return. Like you said, it doesn't blow you away. If I were giving the overall grade for the trade, I'd probably say B plus. Like, it's not A plus. Like, that's where you get at least something in line with the draft pick that they got for Burns, where it's another interesting prospect, or another interesting prospect, and you don't even have to include Myers. Like, maybe that would have been the A plus. But I think it's a good trade that the Brewers did well on. They got two guys who can impact the team this year and then have full team control on both of them for the future. I think Sproat probably impacts the team more, especially early on, but I think both of them are going to help the 2026 Brewers and also probably like the 2029 Brewers. And that's the point of what they're doing here. So I think they did a good job. I don't think, like I said, it wasn't like the perfect deal for them, but I think it's a good trade, and I'm not very worried about how it's going to be handled in terms of the clubhouse stuff.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that. I think it, like you said, not a perfect deal from the Brewers' standpoint, maybe of like feeling like you really made out like thieves on this,
Right.
but a lot of deals aren't actually going to come together that way if that's your approach. So
William Contreras broke us as a fan base, I think. That trade was like the most automatic win anyone had ever seen, and I think sometimes people get caught up on that one. Like, we haven't felt like that since that, and you probably won't ever feel like that again. That was just as clear as it could be day one.
Yes, but you're going to have to fill a lot of innings, but they have a lot of guys to fill those innings, and it's not going to just be one guy filling Freddy Peralta's shoes. It's probably going to be like six guys filling Freddy Peralta's shoes. But I think they have the depth to make it work. They're also very good at developing pitching. And like you said, they still have a good group of guys in that clubhouse. And you talked about how that's Pat Murphy's strong suit. Ultimately, time is going to tell if they struck the balance well, but just kind of looking on paper and talking through some of this stuff, I think they made out pretty well here, and I think they're going to come out looking pretty good on the other side of this, both in 2026 and beyond. I think they're basically in the same place competitively for this year, and then they're better moving forward, that's a big part of how they like to operate. So I think this checked off a lot of boxes that you would like to check off in a Freddy Peralta trade. Again, maybe not every single box, but they got a fair return for him. It was a good deal. And within a few weeks here, we're going to get to start seeing how it plays out.
Yeah.
That's going to do it for us this week on the Brewer Fanatic podcast. We did get a couple questions that were not related to the trade. We're going to try to take those next week because we'll be back with more of a standard episode, just kind of covering some general ins and outs. But until then, thank you all for listening. Baseball is getting closer by the week, and we'll have more for you guys in a few days.